So welcome back. Here we are. We're in our second module for the course. And this time we want to take a look at our first primary component of the criminal justice system, which is law enforcement or police. Now, in this chapter, we're focusing on the history of policing. So just to recap, if you're new to the channel and you're following along this course in real time, the first three chapters primarily focused on foundations in the criminal justice system. First, we had an introduction on what is the criminal justice system and a little bit of an examination on crime. Then we focused on the nature and extent of crime. How do we measure data? Do we get data from official police reports, maybe surveys, the National Crime Victimization Survey? And then we ended chapter 3 looking at law and justice. Now, this chapter is a great segue into what we're going to cover when we get to our second primary component of the criminal justice system, which includes the courts. But here we are getting to the meat and potatoes on what the criminal justice system is. Even though this is introduction to criminal justice, I want you to understand and you to be aware of the fact that we have to tell a story and we have to build a foundation first before jumping into those primary components of the criminal justice system. In this instance, our first one is policing. So let's jump right in, shall we? So here in this chapter, we want to look at the history of policing and understand that policing is considered a dynamic entity. In fact, what we know as policing is relatively new. This notion and idea of having professional uniform police officers on the street, having specialized training, being able to use a firearm or a service pistol, as sometimes they call it, we take it for granted because we live in modern times. But think about hundreds and hundreds of years ago, the idea and notion of having law enforcement like what we know was foreign. It didn't exist. See, contemporary law enforcement, and anytime you hear the term contemporary class, contemporary means modern times. It means today, what's happening right now in our current day and age and affairs. Contemporary police officers are screened and they're educated and they are even trained to protect and serve. But back then, law enforcement didn't have the same level of professional standards. And so within this chapter, we want to highlight the historical information about policing here in the United States, and it will allow us to focus on the origins of law enforcement, because just like we talked about with crime in or with crime in the law, how we had common law and we had contemporary criminal law, which was the basis of why our laws exist in this country. Those laws, common law, was English law, and we talked about the Code of Hammurabi and the Mosaic Code and the Roman 12 tables and all the early forms of law, which all get us to the point today on where we have law in our country. The same goes in terms of law enforcement. We had to have early and humble beginnings, and that's what we're going to delve into in this chapter. So we had early English policing, and boers were the earliest known system of policing in England. The boer was responsible for policing and security, and was a collective of 12 individuals who stood to hold each other accountable and ensure one's good behavior. Think about how you didn't have the standards that you have today in law enforcement. However, back in the early Boer system, you had these 12 men who were good, upstanding men who would be responsible for policing, be responsible for the security and safety of a given area or, parish, so to speak, or locale, and they would hold each other responsible by ensuring everybody was going to maintain good behavior and everyone was going to be engaged in reputable and notable and noteworthy behavior. Now, we have some other types of early law enforcement under the Boer system. You had the parish constable, they'll police smaller towns. They're unarmed, they're unpaid, they're part-time. You had your shire reeves. These were precursors to sheriffs. Your shire reeves were, in some instances, they were very controversial, but they would also be responsible for a certain group or a certain area. You also had your watchmen. They would protect property in larger communities in England and colonial America. Basically they would patrol. They would keep watch at night. So the name watchman is very easy. It's an easy synonymous term with just someone that's watching over the area at night. And then lastly, you had your thief takers. They were hired by victims to capture offenders for a bounty. Essentially, think about thief takers as bounty hunters, but they were very, very corrupt. They used brutal tactics to get these individuals back. Sometimes they would take money from the victim while working and conspiring against the victim with the offender to get more money. They were very, very controversial, hence the name thief takers. They were stealing from people who needed them and using it to better or using it for their financial benefit. So the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829, it was an important advancement in policing. What this act did, and it was introduced by Sir Robert Peel. Sir Robert Peel established London's Metropolitan Police Force based in Scotland Yard. So if you ever hear Scotland Yard is like the equivalent of the main form of policing in England. They're the most known and reputable police agency in England. Think about, it'd be essentially the equivalent of like the FBI. If you hear the FBI, you're like, oh yeah, that's the main federal law enforcement agency in the country. Well, for London, for Great Britain, if you hear Scotland Yard, yeah, that you know that's a law enforcement agency that's getting stuff done. Now, when we look at modern public policing, I'm highlighting this. Sir Robert Peel is the father of modern policing. And what he did was he replaced the old convoluted system and he established a more reputable, more honor-driven system. For example, he labeled law enforcement officers in England as bobbies, again, named after his first name, Robert Bobby. So bobbies. And then, of course, the Irish form of law enforcement officers were known as peelers, named after his last name. But in introducing bobbies and peelers, it got rid of the corrupt system that was in place by parish constables and thief takers and night watchmen. Because as you see, 1/3 of police officers were dismissed annually due to their corruption. But what it did was it brought forth honorable law enforcement officers. Imagine the level of public safety knowing that, hey, I now can trust in my law enforcement officer, knowing that they're not taking my money while working in conjunction with a criminal. So again, he revolutionized policing, modern policing, period. But I'm highlighting this, and as you're watching this and taking notes or just watching this lecture to gather more knowledge, please understand the importance of Sir Robert Peel and how he was the father of modern policing. Now, the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829, he created some guiding principles for bobbies. Essentially, look at this as the form of standards that bobbies and peelers would follow. And he called these Peelian Principles. They were obviously broken into 9, 10, or 12 tenets. But some of these tenets included having the importance of public approval, the need for public cooperation, the need for police to remain impartial, and the use of physical force only when necessary. Now, when I get to the next chapter, chapter 5, when we talk about contemporary issues in policing, this is one of my favorite topics to really lecture on, especially in person, because usually it takes about 3 classes. That's how deep it is. I could easily talk about this for a couple of weeks, and I'll get to that when I present that lecture coming up. However, one of the things that does garner some widespread discussion in class is the use of force. And sometimes people who don't know law enforcement or don't understand law enforcement, they don't have a strong understanding of the use of physical force, even though it's used when necessary. But there's a common misconception that law enforcement likes to use physical force because they can. And that is a myth that, for the most part, has been debunked, but that doesn't mean that there aren't law enforcement officers out there who abuse their power. Again, there's two different topics and scenarios. But anyways, we will cover that when we get to the next chapter. Now, if we know that policing, just as our country was birthed out of Great Britain, our country, the United States of America, was birthed out of Great Britain. We came from Great Britain, hence we speak English. They speak English, they just have an accent to their English, but our English, our version of English is non-accent. We don't have an accent, right? We know that our policing can be traced back to those English roots, just like law can be traced back to English roots with the common law, as I shared before. Now, formalized positions, the appointment by governors, law enforcement officers holding positions by large landowners to protect their lands. Basically, a sheriff, and we'll get to this next chapter, but a sheriff is generally someone who can be appointed by the governor or can be duly elected. However, sheriffs have key responsibilities, such as getting criminals and serving subpoenas and supervising elections, even capturing and collecting taxes. They did do something called reactive police. In other words, reactive policing is that they will handle a crime after it has occurred, as opposed to being proactive. And unfortunately, with colonial sheriffs, they operated in such the same manner as the shire reeves and the parish constables and even the thief takers. They would take fees to enrich themselves at any cost. So if you were paying a colonial sheriff a fee based on, hey, how many people have you arrested? How many taxes have you collected? Well, they might start roughing people up to collect taxes because they want to get a better fee. They might start arresting more people, even those who may not have committed serious crimes, because they know they would get paid. So there was a level of corruption that existed even in early American policing. Now, if we are going to talk about early American policing, we have to understand and recognize the fact that within colonial times, we also had policing that was completed at the hands of people who maybe absolutely should not have been law enforcement officers. So we have vigilantes, and vigilantes perform law enforcement duties with no legal authority. In other words, they had no legal authority, they had no legal backing to perform their law enforcement duties, but yet they did it anyway. And one of the most notable forms of vigilantism was the actions of a Virginia farmer, Charles Lynch. He led a group of men that would track down and punish outlaws and other criminals, and that termed the phrase lynching. So, lynching is a very, what's the best way to put it? It's a very sad and somber and brutal way in which minorities were taken out, so to speak, during, the pre and even civil rights era. Well, another form of early lynching, besides vigilantes and, of course, lynch mobs is what they were called, are the slave patrols. And they originated in 1704, so before we even became a nation. But in South Carolina, you would have 3 to 6 white men who would regulate slave behavior and hunt it and punish escapees. And so some people have said that slave patrols are truly the first organized police organization in America. So it's very important to know that law enforcement in its current sense had a long way to go. Like it previously was seen as something a little bit more corrupt, whether you had the colonial sheriffs or you had vigilantes or you had lynch mobs or you had slave patrols. There was a wide deal of corruption that existed in early law enforcement in this country. Now, one of the things about slave patrols that is important is that slave patrols created difficulty for free black people as they would be subjected to questioning, general harassment, an unreasonable searches and seizure of their property and homes. Now, we'll talk about amendments in probably around chapter maybe 9, 8 or 9, somewhere around there. But generally speaking, the slave patrols would just see a person of color, as you see from this sign right here. Negro man named George. Said Negro is 5 feet 10 inches, high of dark complexion. You'll get a $1,000 reward if you turn him in. And so, being controversial and speaking controversy, if you saw a black man who was 5'10", dark complexion, even though this individual, it says, plays well on the violin, if you saw a man that fit that description, you would turn that man into a slave patrol. And even if the individual said, my name is not George, my name is, Frank, it doesn't matter. Frank would become George and he would get taken back into slavery. It was very controversial. And so when looking at the slave patrols, just going back to the term of lynching, some of the punishments included being maimed, being beaten, and of course, even death, whether a crime was committed or not. It was a very dark and controversial time that existed in our country, and it was all under the veil of law enforcement or law enforcement-like powers. So while Sir Robert Peel is credited with being the father of modern policing, August Vollmer is the father of American policing. So as I like to tell students, you have two individuals that you have to know about, especially if you're in law enforcement. So Robert Peel, father of modern policing. If we didn't have the Peelian Principles and the tenets on just how law enforcement should be fair and free of corruption and should only use physical force when necessary, like those are principles that carry into law enforcement even to this day. But we also have August Vollmer, and Vollmer is the father of American policing because we had colonial sheriffs and we had slave patrols and vigilantes and lynch mobs. And August Vollmer comes around in 1905 and says, we got to do better than what we have had. So what he does is that he says that law enforcement should be free from political pressure. In other words, law enforcement shouldn't feel like because I'm appointed by a governor or because I ran an election, I can only serve the people who voted me. That's not how it works, right? They should also be educated and they should be properly trained and well paid. And we should use and embrace technology in the profession so we could better protect the public. And so he put together this code of ethics which banned political corruption. I question that because we know political corruption does exist. Banned officers getting gifts. I question that too because, sometimes officers do get gifts, and certainly banned the third degree. And what was the third degree? This method used by police officers that included brutalizing an individual to gather information. Think about, you see in the movies, the cop banging the person's head on the desk and be like, tell me what I want. And the person's bleeding and like, no, and bangs his head on the desk again. That's the third degree. August Vollmer said, we don't need that. There's no place in our profession for that type of behavior. So we don't need that and we don't want that. So Vollmer, he was directly responsible for the adoption of many, innovation police technologies today. And so within the innovation, Vollmer takes credit for the flashing signal alarms to alert police quickly. He takes credit for patrols on bikes, which later turned into motorcycles and patrol cars. The establishment of the modus operandi, the method of operation, like what causes the offender to do what they do, what is their, essentially their calling card, or why or how they commit their crimes. Like if they're a petty thief, are they breaking into people's homes at 9 or 10 o'clock at night when people are asleep, whatever. And he also even implemented a lie detector type instrument. And lie detector tests or polygraph examinations are a very key and critical point within law enforcement, especially in the hiring phase. We'll talk about that in the next chapter when we look at law enforcement and who they are. Now, Diversity in policing is important to know, and it's put in this chapter as we examine law enforcement, especially early beginnings, because we know that diversity in general in this country has always been a hot button topic, especially in today's day and age. But in law enforcement, it's a discipline in modern times that was dominated by white men. So, you know, having a more diverse police force, having a diverse police force in communities where the law enforcement officers look like the people who live in that community goes a long way. And again, we'll get into more of that in the next chapter. But policing is generally a man's job. Women are primarily relegated, or were primarily relegated, to clerical work. They just were not getting promoted to becoming law enforcement officers. There was a macho mentality that a woman can't be a police officer. She can't chase somebody down. She can't handcuff a person. She can't go toe to toe with a criminal. She's going to be soft. Like, these are all negative stereotypes that it's like, get out of here. We don't have time for that. But yet diversity in policing waned and struggled in early times. Black officers, same thing. You almost never saw a black police officer that was hired. If you wanted to see Hispanic officers or officers of Hispanic or Spanish heritage, you would see them in Southern territory. So in the Floridas and Texases and New Mexicos and Arizonas, you see them there, but you wouldn't see them in other parts of the country. There's also a big issue with people who are in the, LGBTQIA plus community. And I know, once again, unfortunately, we're in a day and age where diversity and equity and inclusion is something that has been completely taken off the table in most professions. There's a belief that anyone that's hired should be hired on their merit, which, there's nothing wrong with that belief. However, some people argue that if you go by that logic, there's the propensity and possibility that we might miss candidates who have diverse backgrounds that could benefit our agency as a whole. That's not saying we want to hire a black officer or a brown officer or a queer officer because they're queer or they're black or they're brown and we just want to check a box. But with no more diversity and equity and inclusion tactics, unfortunately, people will argue that you might have an outstanding black, brown, or queer officer over here that would and should be hired, but you're not going to hire them because you want your law enforcement agency to look like a certain group of people. And that's wrong. And unfortunately, as we are in these changing times, we are seeing that it's a bigger and bigger issue. But going back to the LGBTQIA plus community, having don't ask, don't tell was a big thing where we're not going to ask you your sexuality and you're not going to tell us. Being openly gay or openly bisexual or homosexual, it was definitely highly unusual in the past because law enforcement generally is like a very macho, very much militaristic profession, and there's the idea and the belief that there is a lot of homophobia that exists, right or wrong. However, the idea and the notion that a person who is gay or who likes a person of the same sex can't be open with who they are and can't be as they cannot be as quick to profess their sexuality because of the fear of retaliation and the fear of potentially maybe even getting fired or receiving some type of reprimand, or maybe just not even given the opportunity of getting the job. And so that's why for individuals who exist in this sexuality and this classification, they cannot they have a significant number of challenges that they sometimes cannot overcome. So the 1960s was a significant period of civil unrest. Policing in the 60s and 70s was noteworthy simply because of what was happening in this country. We were in the midst of a civil rights movement. Now, I like talking about the civil rights movement in the veil of criminal justice, and I like to do it probably better than any professor that's out there, and I feel comfortable and confident in my abilities because we can't look at the civil rights movement and see many of the injustices and the crimes and the riots and all that was happening in this country and say, yeah, criminal justice is not relevant here. Criminal justice is very relevant because a lot of what happened, law enforcement aided in it. In some instances, law enforcement may have assisted in trying to offer protection, but more often than not, during this period, law enforcement was complicit. They sat back and watched things happen and did nothing, or they were willing participants in the mayhem. So with that being said, the role of law enforcement had to drastically change. And as I'm talking about law enforcement being complicit in the civil rights era, I want you to take a look at these pictures. And I put this up in my in-person lecture class. And I've taught this class in front of hundreds of students. And the response is almost universal every time. There's a lot of silence in what I'm about to show. Because for this generation, and this is why I call myself professor for the people, it's educating this new generation, rather, on criminal justice topics and bringing forth a level of knowledge and understanding on a system that a lot of people don't fully understand. These images that I'm going to show you prove that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Again, this is the South. You see the law enforcement officer with German Shepherd. Here's another one. It's law enforcement officer beating somebody. In this instance, obviously law enforcement officers are escorting this person out. We don't know what happened, but this man gets slapped right in the face. And then this one. And this image was an iconic image on a rap album, The Roots. They used this image on the cover of their rap album. But the horror of this woman as she's running away from law enforcement. So a picture is worth 1,000 words, folks. And this is why law enforcement evolved. And yes, this was law enforcement in the South. But law enforcement in general was tainted by these images during the civil rights era, especially in addressing the level of unrest that existed in the country at that time. So rights were expanded by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. President, I believe Lyndon B. Johnson signed this because this was after President Kennedy was assassinated. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then what those acts did was they outlawed discrimination against racial, ethnic, national, and religious minorities and women. Now, the Civil Rights Act stopped this unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation, in schools, the workplace, and general facilities. And these literacy tests ended, and minority voters were protected in select jurisdictions. As you see, as I was pointing out, the Voting Rights Act signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, it ended those literacy tests. Think about it like this. If you were a black person who, obviously you live in this country, you were born in this country, or, you've been in this country for however long, could you imagine having to take one of these literacy tests that you see on the side of your screen? I mean, look at this one, number 20. Spell backwards forwards. What kind of stuff is that? Spell backwards forwards. Number 17 is a math question, but you got to think that many of the individuals didn't have a proper education, so math wasn't their strong point. Same thing with number 18. Number 16, draw a triangle with a blackened circle that overlaps only its left corner. In the space below, write the word noise backwards and place a dot over what would be its second letter should it have been written forward. These literacy tests were done in a manner to confuse people of color and minorities because they didn't want them to vote and they didn't want them to be full-fledged citizens, even though they were. So just bear in mind that with the significant amount of unrest and what was happening in this country in the 60s and 70s, law enforcement had to evolve, and thankfully they did. It's not perfect, but thankfully they had to move from a place of complicitness and certainly being enablers and being involved in the problem to becoming solution-oriented. So following the 1960s and 70s, policing was calmer by comparison. One of the reasons for that was the development and creation of police unions. Now, police unions can be very controversial. There's two types. I'll get into that probably in the next lecture. But with that being said, by having a police union, it was supposed to be designed to make sure policing felt like a brotherhood, but also the union would be protective of the officer. So should you have an officer that does wrongdoing, the union will step in and protect them, even if they're wrong. But there was a renewed call for policing to be more than just a law enforcement officer, being more connected to the community. And I'm going to talk about this, about being connected to the community in the next lecture that I do, because that's the one that I'm closely associated with. I can't wait. So, I'm not going to go into great detail about my past, but I do want to bring it to your recollection, because it's important. And the fact that having worked in law enforcement, it gives me a unique insight on some of the ins and outs of a law enforcement agency. But remember, even though it was almost 100 years ago when Vollmer came up with some of his core principles for how law enforcement officers should act, he calls on officers to not only be enforcers, but to embrace a social worker role. And again, we're going to see in the coming chapters how law enforcement officers' role is ever changing, and it's challenging all at the same time. So to wrap up this chapter, we talked about the history of policing, and there was a lot of key points there. But as I try to share with you all, anytime I do a chapter wrap up, I want to bring you to two key points, or a key point that you absolutely should remember. One, Sir Robert Peel is the father of modern policing. Those Peelian principles are what guides law enforcement to this day. Law enforcement should be respectful. Law enforcement should be honorable and trustworthy. Law enforcement, should be free of controversy, etc. Those Peelian principles, Sir Robert Peel. And then, of course, when we look at American policing, what we have right here in the United States, August Vollmer in the early 1900s, he created a system of, using technology, having a filing system, of course, a lie detector test, polygraph. Like, all of those advances are advances in law enforcement that are felt even to this day. So please keep those two primary key points in mind. But as we looked at the history of policing, I wanted to show you some of the early forms of policing. There was a lot of controversy that existed, not just from the parish constables and the shirees, but even with the slave patrols and the vigilantes and the lynch mobs, and how policing in the 60s and 70s had to evolve to what it is today. Not being a part of the problem, but being a part of the solution. Of course, as you know, we will talk about controversies in law enforcement in the next chapter as we focus on contemporary issues in law enforcement. So we're going to end right there. I want to thank you so much for your time. Thank you for tuning in. We will definitely see you next time.